Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals on Gran Turismo, and this particular Rivals match is one which has actually been requested a couple of times between some very closely competitive vehicles, not just on the game, but in real life as well. And although some of these cars had more success than others in certain ways, they are all very competitive race cars on Gran Turismo. These are the 90s GT1 cars, in particular the later 90s, say 97, 98. But there are a couple of cars which are probably expecting to be here, which actually aren't. Probably most notably the Toyota GT1. And the reason why I'm not featuring that car is because I'm saving that one for a one-on-one match against the other Le Mans car from 1999, the BMW V12 LMR, because neither the Toyota or the BMW have been featured in a Rivals match to date. So for this pick we have Panoz, Mercedes, McLaren and Nissan. So first of all we'll break down each car and then, as we always do, compare them on paper. First up then we have the Panoz Esperante, or more specifically the GTR1. This is one of my favourite race cars in the game. For those who don't know, Panoz is actually my favourite racing team, and I love this car. I've always loved this car on Gran Turismo because it looks oddball, it's different, it's one of the relatively few front-engine GT cars of this kind of calibre, and although it is completely inaccurately represented on the game, in particular as far as weight, it's far too heavy, it is still a surprisingly fast car. Now, around this particular track, it was the slowest of the four. Just to say that straight off the bat, it was around 4 seconds, unfortunately, slower than the other three cars in this rivalry, which is unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. As far as performance though, it's not a slouch by any means. It can do over 260 miles per hour, which is actually quicker than a couple of the other cars here, and the handling is not bad. It is heavier than some, the front engine layout makes it a little bit different, and the excess weight unfortunately does really badly affect the car. But as I said, it's not slow, it makes a good endurance race car because it's quite smooth to drive, and personally, I would choose it over any of these other cars any day of the week. What then about the Nissan? Well, of these four cars, the Nissan, funnily enough, tends to be the one which is most often, at least from what I've seen, fielded against cars which technically are far superior to it, such as the 787B from Mazda and the GT1 from Toyota, because although the Nissan is good, it's not as good as those cars. It's significantly heavier than both of them, not as powerful as the Toyota, and not as quick as either of them in a straight line or around most tracks. And yet, when you think of those cars, you often put the R390 in that same kind of level. Now, newer Gran Turismo players might not think of that as much, but if you've been playing the game for longer, you'll probably remember that the R390 has always been in that mix of the top 3 best cars in the game, especially in GT2 and GT3. And although it's no longer the dominating force that it used to be on Gran Turismo, it's still a great car. It is the most powerful of these four vehicles, and although it is heavier than some, at 1,000 kilos, it's not slow by any means. It's remarkably quick around the track, especially for a vehicle that does weigh more than many LMP vehicles. And that brings us next up to the Mercedes, the CLK LM. It used to be called the CLK GTR on Gran Turismo, but that was because it was inaccurate. The CLK GTR actually has a V12 engine, whereas the CLK LM uses a lighter V8. This car is a very good all-rounder, but it's not necessarily the best at any one particular thing. I saw a huge amount of use from this car on Gran Turismo 5 in particular. It's a fantastic car that you can win relatively easily on that game, and it will dominate most of the races that you put it in. On GT6, not so much. Although it does have more power than it had on GT5, 953 horsepower to be exact, it's just not really as good as you'd expect or hope that a Mercedes race car would be. The Sauber C9 is a fantastic Le Mans car. The CLK LM, at least on the game, just isn't that kind of level of good. It's not bad, not by any means, it can certainly win races, but of these four cars, it's probably my least used on Gran Turismo 6, and although it is definitely quicker than the Panoz, I still just don't find myself using the Mercedes really at all. It's not a bad car in any way, but it's not quite good enough to be dominant in any way. And that brings us finally to the McLaren F1 GTR, the long-tail form in particular from the BMW dealership. This has been on Gran Turismo as far back as GT4, and although it was pretty good back then, it's arguably better now than it was on GT4. On Gran Turismo 6, it's a very, very good GT-style race car, and it actually bridges the gap quite nicely between a traditional GT machine and being almost a prototype in terms of how good it is. And speaking of being almost as good as a prototype, this is the lightest car of the four at only 950 kilos. And because that weight is so low and the platform of the McLaren F1 is so strong anyway, even though it is the least powerful car of the four, it was still the quickest around this track, at least with my tuning and my driving. So that's it for a rundown of each of the four cars, each with their own personality for sure. But which one wins on paper? Well, let's find out. Well, as you lay out the specs of the cars on screen, you can, as we usually do, see certain ways that a certain car or cars will dominate a certain point. When you come into stuff like GT class racing, GT1s, GT3s, that kind of stuff, the gaps between them, though, don't tend to be quite as large. The playing field is usually a bit more even than something that you'd see in, for instance, the LMP classes or Group C, where one car will often just totally run away with a certain point, be it power, torque, price, that kind of thing. Whereas with these cars, although there are some clear winners here and there, all four of them have very strong numbers. Now, first of all, we have, of course, the price of the cars. And again, they're all very similar. You've got two cars that are 1.7 million, two cars that are 1.8 million. Very close between all four, but of course the two vehicles with the price of 1.7, which is the Nissan and the Panos, ironically kind of both ends of the spectrum, they are both 1.7 million credit cars. So, of course, they both get a point there. As far as engine capacity, you would probably expect the Panos to be the biggest, being the American car, and it is. But it doesn't actually win by as much of a margin as you might expect, because the McLaren, with its 6-litre BMW engine, is not far behind. Only 5cc separates the two vehicles, but overall the point does go to the Panos. As far as the PP levels of the cars, the margins between them aren't as big as you might expect. The Panos in particular is still quite high, even though it has less than 1,000 horsepower and is far too heavy. The margin does, though, fall in favour quite well to the Nissan at 691, and then even the nearest thing, the McLaren, is 9 points away. So a decent enough margin for the Nissan there. As far as power as well, the point also goes to the Nissan, but by a much more significant margin, with almost 1,100 horsepower, and the second most powerful being the Panos, which doesn't even have 1,000. But of course, overall the point does go to the Nissan. Also, interestingly, as far as torque, the Nissan R390 is also the highest, which, considering it has the smallest engine of the bunch, is quite impressive. It has a very high 903 pound-feet of torque, which beats out the second place car, again, the Panos, by quite a decent margin. Around 40 foot-pounds difference separates the two. As far as weight, though, it swings in favour of course, the McLaren. We already touched on the fact that it is lighter, and in the case of the Panos, it's a lot lighter. It weighs 50 kilos more than two of the other cars, and in the case of the Panos, 200 kilos more. So you do start to see why the Panos is going to fall behind on the track. It's essentially like all three of the other cars having a 200 kilo ballast. That's the kind of difference that we're talking about. As far as horsepower per tonne, though, although the McLaren is lighter, it's also the least powerful. So again, the point actually goes to the Nissan with 1,090 horsepower per tonne. All four cars have fantastic horsepower per tonne ratios though, and interestingly, despite the fact that their power and their weight are different, as you can see, the Mercedes and the McLaren, funnily enough, have the exact same horsepower per tonne. And finally, although, as always, we do not award a point based on the lap time that the car achieved, because there are just far too many variables involved, the driver, the tuning, the track, definitely, but on this occasion, The fastest car was the McLaren, then in second, not too surprisingly, is the Nissan, then in third is the Mercedes, and although those three are in similar kind of time frames, falling quite far behind is my personal favourite of the four, the Panos. So, overall, that means that the car coming in fourth, perhaps surprisingly, and kind of disappointingly for some, with 0 points, is actually the Mercedes CLK LM. Not a bad car by any means, but just not strong enough, as I said, in any particular way to dominate. Then, perhaps even more surprisingly, coming in third is the very popular and quickest of the four on this occasion, the McLaren, with only 1 point. Then coming in second is my personal favourite, the Panos, with 2 points, but coming in first place, of course, by rule of elimination, is, of course, the Nissan R390 with 5 points. So it doesn't just win by a small amount, it really dominates. And although on this occasion it certainly wasn't the quickest of the four, in terms of sheer numbers, it does beat the others out. But if you can spare the time to get the cash and try out all four cars, I would definitely recommend doing so, because although some of them won't get used as much by most people, such as the Mercedes or the Panos for most people, they all do have not necessarily their own dominating advantages, but certainly their own personalities, their own fun factors, their own disadvantages as well. But overall, they're all interesting and definitely fun to drive, and at the end of the day, they can all give you victories. But that's it overall for this particular Rivals match. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.